1959, the United States Army began digging a city beneath the Greenland ice sheet. They called it Camp Century. They told the world it was a research station. They did not tell the world, and they did not tell Denmark, that it was the prototype for something much larger. A network of tunnels 3 times the size of Denmark itself, housing 600 nuclear missiles, hidden under the ice, aimed at Moscow. This is the story of Project Iceworm. Chapter 1. The Top of the World. To understand why anyone would attempt something this insane, you have to look at a globe, but not the way you usually look at one. Spin it so the North Pole is facing you. Now look at where Greenland sits. It's almost exactly halfway between Washington and Moscow, lying directly across the shortest air route between the two superpowers. In 1959, that geographic accident was the most strategically valuable real estate on Earth. The United States had been working its way into Greenland since the Second World War. When Nazi Germany occupied Denmark in 1940, American forces moved into Greenland to keep it out of German hands. After the war, they stayed. In 1949, Denmark joined NATO. In 1951, the two countries signed the Defense of Greenland Agreement, which gave the Americans the right to build military bases on the island. And build they did. 3 air bases. A massive radar network called the Distant Early Warning Line, designed to spot Soviet bombers crossing the Arctic. The Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, watching for incoming nuclear missiles. And, looming over all of it, Thule Air Base, a sprawling complex less than 1,000 miles from the North Pole, home to bombers, fighters, nuclear weapons, and over 10,000 American servicemen. But by the late 1950s, the United States Army had a problem, a bureaucratic problem. President Eisenhower's defense policy had divided the budget like a pie. The Air Force got 49%, the Navy got 29%, and the Army was left with the smallest slice, 22%. Worse, the future of warfare clearly belonged to long-range nuclear missiles, and the Air Force had claimed those with its Minuteman silos buried in the American Midwest. The Navy had claimed the rest with its Polaris missiles aboard nuclear submarines. The Army had nothing. No long-range nuclear role, no seat at the strategic table. In the new world of intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Army was looking increasingly obsolete. So Army planners began searching for a way back in. They needed somewhere to put missiles, somewhere the Air Force and Navy couldn't claim, somewhere that offered a unique strategic advantage. They looked at the globe, they saw Greenland, and someone, somewhere in the Pentagon, asked a question that should never have been taken seriously. What if we hid them under the ice? Chapter 2. The Plan. In 1960, the Planning Studies Division of the U.S. Army Engineer Studies Center produced a document titled Strategic Value of the Greenland Icecap. It was the founding document of Project Iceworm, and the scale of what it proposed is genuinely difficult to comprehend. Iceworm would carve 4,000 kilometers of tunnels into the Greenland ice sheet. 2,500 miles of corridors beneath the snow, covering an area of 52,000 square miles. That's 3 times the size of Denmark, larger than the state of Alabama. There were entire countries smaller than Iceworm would have been. Inside this vast subterranean network, the Army would deploy 600 nuclear missiles. They would be a modified version of the Air Force's Minuteman, shortened to 2 stages and adapted for Arctic conditions. The Army called this missile the Iceman. It would have a range of 3,300 miles, putting Moscow, Leningrad, and most of the Soviet Union's strategic targets within reach. Each missile would carry a thermonuclear warhead with a yield of 2.4 megatons, with an option to upgrade to 4 megatons. For comparison, the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. Iceman warheads would have been over 150 times more powerful. But here's where the plan becomes truly extraordinary. The 600 missiles wouldn't sit in fixed silos, they would be constantly moving. Iceworm called for 2,100 separate launch positions, spaced 4 miles apart, all connected by an underground railway. Specially designed rail vehicles would shuttle the missiles between launch points on an irregular schedule. New tunnels would be dug every year, expanding the network and creating new firing positions. The idea was that no one, not the Soviets, not their satellites, not their spies, would ever know which tunnels held real missiles and which were empty. It would be the world's largest, deadliest shell game. Even if Moscow somehow located and destroyed 3/4 of the launch sites, the surviving missiles would be enough to obliterate the Soviet Union. To run this complex would require 11,000 soldiers living year-round inside the ice sheet. 60 launch control centers would coordinate the missile movements and firing orders. The estimated cost was $2.37 billion in 1960 money, roughly $25 billion in today's currency. And the entire thing, every tunnel, every missile, every man, would be invisible from the surface. The ice itself would be the armor. The ice itself would be the camouflage. It was, on paper, the perfect deterrent. A nuclear arsenal that could survive any first strike, retaliate within 20 minutes, and could never be located. There was just one small problem. The ice wasn't going to cooperate. And the Danish government, the people who actually owned Greenland, had absolutely no idea this plan existed. Chapter 3. The Letter. In the spring of 1957, Denmark held a general election. The Social Democrats campaigned on a clear popular position: no nuclear weapons on Danish soil. Ever. After they won, they formed a coalition government with 2 other parties who held the same view. The new Prime Minister, H.C. Hansen, confirmed the policy in Parliament. Denmark was a NATO ally, but Denmark was nuclear-free. This created an awkward problem for Washington. American strategy depended on being able to fly nuclear-armed bombers over Greenland and store nuclear weapons at Thule Air Base. Asking Denmark for explicit permission would almost certainly result in a public refusal and a propaganda victory for Moscow. So the State Department decided on a different approach. They called it a very private and informal approach to the Danish government. On the 13th of November, 1957, the American ambassador to Denmark, Val Petersen, met privately with Prime Minister Hansen in Copenhagen. Petersen asked a carefully worded question. Did Hansen wish to be informed if the United States decided to place nuclear weapons in Greenland? It wasn't a request for permission. It was an offer of information. The phrasing mattered. 5 days later, Hansen replied, not in a meeting, not in a phone call, in a letter so sensitive that only one copy existed on each side. In it, Hansen wrote that he had gathered the American government did not see any problem with this matter. He noted that Petersen had not submitted a concrete plan and had not asked for the Danish government's attitude, and then came the line that would haunt Danish politics for the next 40 years. Hansen wrote, quote, "I do not think that your remarks give rise to any comments from my side." That was it. No objection, no demand for details, no briefing for his cabinet, no briefing for Parliament, just silence, dressed up as polite diplomatic prose. In Washington, Ambassador Petersen interpreted Hansen's non-answer as a green light. He cabled home that the United States had fulfilled its obligation to the Prime Minister. Within weeks, American nuclear weapons began arriving at Thule Air Base. At the NATO summit the following month, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles personally thanked Hansen for the helpful arrangements. The Danish public would not learn what their Prime Minister had agreed to for 38 years. And H.C. Hansen's letter would become the legal fig leaf that the US Army would later use to justify Project Iceworm. Chapter 4. Camp Century. You cannot build 600 missile silos under an ice sheet without first proving you can build anything under an ice sheet. Before Iceworm could become real, the Army needed a test bed. They needed to prove that men could live and work for years inside a glacier. They needed to prove that an ice tunnel could shelter a nuclear reactor. They needed to prove the concept. That test bed was Camp Century. In May 1959, 2 American Army officers, Colonel John Kirkering and Captain Thomas Evans, stood on a featureless white plateau 6,600 feet above sea level, 150 miles east of Thule Air Base, taking measurements. They needed flat ice. They needed a slope of less than 1 degree. They needed somewhere remote enough to be defensible, but accessible enough to be supplied. Once they'd chosen the site, the construction effort was staggering. 6,000 tons of equipment had to be hauled across the ice sheet from Thule. The vehicles that did the hauling, convoys of tractor-pulled sleds called heavy swings, moved at a maximum speed of 2 miles per hour. A single trip from Thule to the camp took 70 hours. The construction technique was elegantly simple. Swiss-built rotary snow-milling machines, nicknamed Peter Plows, carved long trenches into the firn, the compacted snow at the surface of the ice sheet. Each Peter Plow could move 1,200 cubic yards of snow per hour. Once a trench was cut, engineers placed a curved corrugated steel arch over the top, then piled the excavated snow back over the arch. Within weeks, the snow recompacted and the trench became a tunnel buried beneath several meters of solid ice. The Army called this technique cut and cover. By October 1960, just 16 months after construction began, Camp Century was complete. 21 main trenches, nearly 2 miles of corridors, all interconnected. The largest, called Main Street, was over 1,000 feet long. And inside this network, the Army had built a fully functioning city. There were heated dormitories that kept temperatures at 72 degrees Fahrenheit, even when outside it was -70. There was a mess hall, a modern kitchen, a 10-bed hospital with X-ray and surgical equipment. There were laboratories, a communication center, and a library. There was a recreation hall, a theater, a chapel, and a barbershop. There were laundries, hot showers, and full plumbing. There was a vehicle maintenance bay. There were 15 escape hatches leading to the surface. The water supply was perhaps the most ingenious feature. Engineers drilled a borehole into the ice and pumped steam down it, melting out a cavity. The cavity filled with fresh, clean water, which was pumped up and used by the camp. Every day, Camp Century drew about 10,000 gallons of water from this well. The water was tested regularly for pathogens, including, somewhat alarmingly, plague. 200 soldiers and scientists lived inside this buried city. They slept in heated bunks. They watched movies. They wrote letters home when the radio could reach. They worked in offices and labs that were, by any reasonable standard, more comfortable than the average military posting in 1962. But Camp Century needed power, a lot of power, and the Army had a new idea about how to provide it. Chapter 5. The Reactor. It was called the PM-2A, a prefabricated, pressurized, light water-cooled nuclear reactor. The first portable nuclear reactor ever built. The Army's idea was simple. If you could break a reactor down, ship it to anywhere on Earth, and reassemble it, you could power a military base at the top of the world, or, eventually, the missile complex of Project Iceworm itself. The PM-2A was built by Alco Products in Schenectady, New York. It took 18 months to design and construct. When it was loaded onto the cargo ship Marine Fiddler in Buffalo, it was the most valuable single shipment ever to leave that port. It arrived at Thule on the 10th of July, 1960. Then 400 tons of components, pipes, machinery, the reactor vessel itself, were dragged in 27 separate packages across 138 miles of ice sheet to Camp Century. On a freezing day in October 1960, the PM-2A reactor went critical for the first time. The men in the control room held their breath. There was a flash of relief, a muttered triumph. And then, almost immediately, an alarm. The reactor was leaking neutrons. Radiation was spilling into the surrounding ice. The men shut it down within minutes. They knew that even brief exposure could kill them. What followed was a desperate engineering improvisation. The Army shipped in lead shielding. They built crude additional walls out of 55-gallon drums filled with ice and sawdust. They jury-rigged the most powerful object on the ice sheet into something that wouldn't slowly poison its operators. Eventually, they got it working. The PM-2A ran for 33 months. It powered the camp's lights, heating, and equipment. It melted the water well. It generated, the Army boasted, the equivalent of 1 million gallons of diesel fuel from just 44 pounds of uranium. But the radiation problem never fully went away. The reactor's steel pipes grew progressively more radioactive. Sodium in the surrounding snow was activated by stray neutrons. Cooling water leaking from the system contained dozens of radioactive isotopes, and every gallon of that contaminated water, about 47,000 gallons in total, was dumped into an unlined sump in the ice. To be entombed, the engineers assumed, forever. That assumption would later become very, very important. But for now, in 1961 and 1962, Camp Century was running. The reactor was humming. 200 men were living inside a glacier powered by atomic energy in the most sophisticated subterranean facility ever built. And the Army was finally ready to test the part of the plan that actually mattered, the missiles. Chapter 6. The ice fights back. The first test came almost immediately. Engineers built a 1,300-foot stretch of railway track inside one of Camp Century's tunnels. They mounted a truck on railway wheels, a stand-in for what would eventually be a missile-carrying rail car. They began running it back and forth, measuring how the surrounding ice behaved under repeated loads. The results were not what anyone hoped for. The Army's geologists had treated the Greenland ice sheet as a solid foundation, like rock, like concrete, something you could carve into and trust to stay put. They were wrong. Ice and firn are what physicists call viscoelastic materials. Under their own enormous weight, they deform continuously. They flow. They creep. The Greenland ice sheet, despite appearing motionless, is in constant slow movement, spreading outward from its center. At Camp Century, the consequences were immediate and brutal. Tunnel walls bulged inward by several feet every year. Ceilings began to sag. The steel arches that supported the corridors started to buckle under the pressure. The 1,300-foot test railway, the linchpin of the entire Iceworm concept, was warped within months. It became impossible to run the test truck along it. The men at Camp Century fought back the only way they could. Soldiers armed with electric chainsaws roamed the tunnels, shaving back the closing walls like sculptors. It was constant, exhausting work. As fast as they trimmed, the ice closed in again. Then came the most alarming development. By the summer of 1962, the ceiling of the reactor room had dropped so far that the entire reactor housing had to be jacked up 5 feet to keep it from being crushed. Engineers were now in the position of physically lifting a working nuclear reactor to keep up with a moving glacier. Ice core samples taken at the camp painted an even worse picture. At the rate the firn was deforming, Camp Century's tunnels would be unusable in about 2 years. And if the Army actually tried to build Iceworm to carve 4,000 kilometers of tunnels and fill them with hundreds of nuclear missiles, those missiles would be sitting inside a structure that was actively trying to crush them. The launch tubes would deform. The railway tracks would buckle. The missiles themselves might tip over before they could even be fired. This was not a problem you could engineer around. It was physics. The Greenland ice sheet was alive, slow, patient, and absolutely indifferent to American Cold War strategy. It would close every tunnel you dug, no matter how many chainsaw-wielding soldiers you sent to fight it. By 1963, the writing was on the wall. Or rather, it was creeping in from the wall. The Iceman missile that the Army had been so proud of. It would never fly from Greenland. The 2,100 firing positions. They would never be built. The shell game beneath the ice? It was over before it had really begun. Project Iceworm had been defeated by snow. Chapter 7. Cancellation. The end came quietly. In 1963, the US Army formally cancelled Project Iceworm. There was no press conference, no public statement. The plan had been classified from the start, and its death was classified too. The technical failures were the proximate cause. But there were other reasons. The Air Force's Minuteman missiles were already deploying in their hardened silos across the American Midwest. The Navy's Polaris submarines were already on patrol, silent, mobile, and almost impossible to find. The Kennedy administration, which had taken Iceworm seriously for a time, ultimately chose a different path for NATO nuclear sharing. The so-called multilateral force, a fleet of Polaris-armed surface ships. With that decision, Iceworm lost its last political constituency. There was also the small looming problem that no one had ever actually told the Danish government what was being planned on their soil. If the project had ever progressed to deployment, that conversation would have been catastrophic. So, the Army folded. In late July 1963, the PM-2A reactor was shut down for a planned maintenance break and never restarted. In summer 1964, it was disassembled and removed. It was eventually buried in a nuclear waste dump in Idaho. Camp Century itself ran on diesel power for 2 more summers, hosting scientific research, before being evacuated in 1965 and formally abandoned in 1966. When the last team left, they took the reactor and the most sensitive equipment. They left almost everything else behind. The buildings, the vehicles, the fuel, the sewage, the radioactive cooling water. They assumed it would all be entombed forever by the eternal snowfall of Greenland. They were wrong about that too. Chapter 8. The secret comes out. For 30 years, Project Iceworm sat in classified files in the United States and Denmark. The American public never learned about it. Most of the soldiers who had worked at Camp Century never learned about it. As far as the world was concerned, Camp Century had been exactly what the Army said it was, a research station, a curious Cold War experiment, a footnote. The truth came out almost by accident. On the 21st of January 1968, an American B-52 bomber carrying 4 hydrogen bombs crashed on the sea ice near Thule Air Base. The bombs ruptured. Radioactive material spread across North Star Bay. The Danish government, which had been telling its citizens for over a decade that there were no nuclear weapons in Greenland, had to explain how 4 of them had just fallen out of the sky. For years, the official story held that the bomber had been on an emergency diversion. But declassified American documents began appearing in the 1990s that contradicted this. Investigative journalists, particularly the Dane Paul Brink, dug into the archives. In 1995, the scandal exploded. The Danish press called it Thulegate. The Danish Parliament commissioned a full investigation by the Danish Institute of International Affairs. When the 2-volume report was published on the 17th of January 1997, it confirmed that nuclear weapons had been stored at Thule for years. It revealed the H.C. Hansen letter and the tacit deal with Washington. And buried within its pages, almost as a side note, was the complete plan for Project Iceworm, the 1960 strategic study, the 1962 deployment document, the 600 missiles, the shell game beneath the ice. The world finally knew. Chapter 9. The Ice Remembers. Here's the strangest twist in this entire story. The most important thing to come out of Project Iceworm wasn't strategic, it wasn't political, it was scientific, and it was almost entirely accidental. While the Army was building tunnels and testing reactors, a small group of glaciologists from the U.S. Army Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory was doing something far less glamorous. They were drilling. Between 1963 and 1966, working in the steadily collapsing tunnels of Camp Century, they drilled an ice core 1,390 meters deep. It was the first ice core ever drilled all the way through a major ice sheet to the bedrock below. In 1964, a Danish geophysicist named Ville Dansgaard talked his way onto the project. Dansgaard had a theory that the ratio of oxygen isotopes trapped in ancient ice could reveal the temperature of the atmosphere when that ice fell as snow. With permission to analyze the Camp Century core, he and his colleagues processed 1,600 samples. In 1969, they published their results in the journal Science. The paper was called 1,000 Centuries of Climatic Record from Camp Century on the Greenland Ice Sheet. It was the first 100,000-year continuous record of Earth's climate ever produced. It revealed glacial cycles, interglacial warm periods, and rapid climate shifts that would later be named Dansgaard-Oeschger events. It is, without exaggeration, the foundational document of modern paleoclimatology. But there was more. Beneath the ice itself, the drillers had recovered a 12-foot-long tube of frozen sediment from the bedrock. Nobody knew what to do with it. It was placed in a freezer, transferred between institutions, and eventually forgotten in a Copenhagen storage facility for 50 years. In 2017, scientists rediscovered it. When they opened it, they found something extraordinary. Fossil plant fragments, moss, insect parts, evidence of a tundra landscape. Recent analyses have shown that the ice over Camp Century melted away as recently as 416,000 years ago, during a warm period only slightly hotter than today. Greenland's ice, it turns out, is not as permanent as anyone thought. Chapter 10. What's still down there? Which brings us to the problem the Army never anticipated. In 2016, the glaciologist William Colgan published a study in Geophysical Research Letters that catalogued, for the first time, exactly what had been left behind at Camp Century. The numbers were not reassuring. 200,000 litres of diesel fuel, 240,000 litres of untreated sewage, persistent organic pollutants, including PCBs, around 9,000 tons of physical infrastructure, and the radioactive cooling water from the PM2A reactor, over 1 billion becquerels of low-level radiological waste sitting in an unlined sump in the ice. Colgan's models suggested that as climate change accelerated, the site of Camp Century could shift from net snowfall to net melt as early as 2090. Once that happened, the contaminants would begin migrating toward the surface, eventually into the ocean. The study triggered a diplomatic incident between the United States, Denmark, and Greenland, which had become self-governing in 2009. Greenland demanded that anyone, take responsibility for the waste. The result was the Camp Century Climate Monitoring Program, which has been measuring the site continuously since 2017. The latest data is somewhat more reassuring than the 2016 alarm. Snow accumulation continues to outpace melting. The buried debris is sinking deeper, not rising. Colgan himself now states that, on current trends, there is no risk of the waste reaching the surface before 2100. But beyond 2100, that, like so much about climate change, depends on choices that haven't been made yet. Camp Century is still down there, crushed, buried, contaminated, and waiting. Chapter 11. Rediscovery. In April 2024, a NASA scientist named Chad Green was flying over Greenland in a Gulfstream 3, testing a new radar system. The aircraft was scanning the ice sheet from above, looking for the bedrock far below. And then something appeared on the readout that shouldn't have been there. Parallel structures, geometric patterns, a network of corridors buried 30 meters beneath the surface. "We were looking for the bed of the ice," one of the team leaders said, "and out pops Camp Century." NASA released the imagery in November 2024. For the first time in 57 years, the world could see the city under the ice. It is still there. The tunnels collapsed long ago. The buildings inside them are crushed. The reactor's cooling water still sits in its sump. The ice remembers everything. Thank you for watching Octerra. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing. There are many more stories like this one waiting to be told.